The camera feed stuttered, a brief flicker of digital noise before stabilizing on the face of Wayne Carter, illuminated by the stark glow of his headlamp. He adjusted the angle, flashing an amused grin at the audience. "All right, folks," he said, voice carrying through the quiet forest. "We're about 4 miles into Blackwood National Forest, and Wes is already convinced we're being watched." The camera shifted to Wesley Hanlon, his face half-lit, casting deep shadows across the sharp lines of his features. He let out a dramatic sigh and leaned closer to the lens. "I don't think we're being watched," Wes corrected, voice laced with mock severity. "I know we are." The live chat at the bottom of the screen filled with scrolling text. A mix of skeptics and believers flooded the feed, some urging them forward, others taunting their nerves. Wayne snorted, shaking his head. Classic Wes. You hear some leaves rustling, and suddenly Bigfoot himself is breathing down your neck. "Not Bigfoot," Wes corrected. "The Imitator." Wayne rolled his eyes, but he didn't interrupt as Wes turned the camera toward the skeletal trees stretching into the pitch-black expanse ahead. "Local legend," Wes continued, his voice taking on the same theatrical cadence he used whenever recounting cryptid lore. "People say there's something in these woods that learns you. Studies you. And then, when it's ready," he snapped his fingers. "It becomes you." The chat erupted in response, some laughing, others expressing discomfort. One user, S3ans42, typed, "That's why no one ever finds the missing people." "They do, but they don't know it," Wayne scoffed. "That's some real comforting stuff." "Thanks, buddy." Wes ignored him, continuing his tale as they walked. "Hunters, campers, hell, even some cops, have reported weird sounds out here. Voices calling from the trees, but no one's there. Sometimes, the voices repeat things they just said, but all off." Wayne grinned at the camera. "So, what you're saying is, if I call your name." "Don't," Wes cut in, shoving him lightly. Wayne chuckled but let it drop. The forest swallowed the sound. Even with their flashlights, the darkness pressed against them, damp and cloying. Leaves rustled in the breeze, and branches groaned overhead, but no birds called. No crickets chirped. Even the distant hum of nocturnal life had quieted, leaving only the steady crunch of their boots against the underbrush. Wes slowed, eyes darting toward the trees. "Okay," Wayne muttered, lowering the camera slightly. "What?" Wes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised a hand, motioning for silence. He tilted his head, listening. The chat swarmed with speculation. "Did you hear that?" There was a whisper. "Guys, what's wrong?" Then, from somewhere ahead, a voice cut through the night. "Okay, what?" Wayne's blood ran cold. The voice's tone was flat and toneless, but it was unmistakably his. He swung the camera forward, scanning the tree line. Nothing but gnarled branches and skeletal trunks, swaying slightly in the wind. "Tell me you heard that," Wes whispered. Wayne swallowed hard. "It's an echo." "An echo from what?" Wayne didn't have an answer. The chat filled with alarmed messages, frantic and confused. "Play it back." "There was something behind you." "Dude, it sounded just like Wayne." Wayne forced a laugh, the sound brittle. Okay. Let's not freak out over a weird sound." Then, from behind them, something spoke. Okay. Let's not freak out." Every muscle in Wayne's body seized. The words had been repeated, but twisted, like someone struggling to recall how a sentence should be structured. Like a machine attempting to mimic speech but failing just enough to make it wrong. Wes let out a strangled breath. Wayne gripped his flashlight tighter, angling it toward the undergrowth. The beam stretched deep into the trees, illuminating nothing but more endless dark. Then, a figure, barely visible between the trunks, shifted. Wayne whipped the camera toward it, catching only a glimpse before it moved, fast, impossibly fast, vanishing into the shadows. The chat exploded. Run. WTF was that? Oh hell no. Behind you. Wes swore under his breath while Wayne forced himself to keep the camera steady. He wanted to believe it was an animal, a trick of the light, but his gut screamed otherwise. We keep moving, he said quietly. Wes hesitated, then nodded. They pressed forward, moving faster now, the tension thick between them. The chat continued its frantic warnings, but Wayne ignored them, too focused on keeping his nerves steady. The night pressed in. Somewhere, just beyond the reach of their lights, something was listening. The forest had changed. Wayne felt it before he could put words to it, the sensation creeping in like a slow infection. The trees pressed closer, their branches gnarled and reaching, as if they had grown denser in the last few minutes. It was impossible, but so was the voice that had spoken behind them, warping his own words into something wrong. The chat scrolled in frantic bursts at the bottom of the screen. The feed was still running, thousands watching, waiting, urging them to leave. Wes didn't need convincing. He kept close, his movements clipped and tense, headlamp casting erratic beams of light across the forest floor. His breathing had gone shallow, barely audible over the crunch of their boots. Wayne's fingers felt stiff around the camera, his grip tightening with each step. Let's just. A voice cut through the dark. Let's just. Wayne whipped around, the camera swinging wildly. Nothing but trees, gaping dark between them. His breath hitched as the realization set in. It had come from ahead of them this time. Wes locked eyes with him, and though neither of them spoke, the understanding was instant. It wasn't behind them anymore. It had circled. Wayne forced his voice to remain even. We keep moving. Wes nodded. We get back to the truck. The chat erupted in agreement. Wayne adjusted the camera strap over his shoulder and picked up the pace, his pulse hammering beneath his ribs. They had made it out of worse. The human mind played tricks in the dark. How many times had they gone hunting for ghosts, cryptids, urban legends, only to walk away with nothing but eerie stories and high engagement rates? That had to be what this was, except, it wasn't. The sensation of being watched had sharpened, a needle-like pressure against the back of his neck. No matter where he turned, it felt like something had already moved, just out of sight. Then, they heard a whisper, coming from the left, curling through the trees like mist. Wayne. His steps faltered. It had spoken his name. He turned sharply, the camera catching only the trembling leaves where something had just been. The sound of movement rippled ahead of them, a low rustling, the barest scrape of something brushing tree bark. Not quite footsteps, but close. Wayne caught up to Wes, speaking low. I don't care what kind of viral gold this is, we end the stream when we hit the clearing. No argument here. They moved quickly, the path twisting in unfamiliar ways. The trail should have been straightforward, but every turn seemed wrong. Had they come from that direction? No, hadn't that tree been on the left before? The chat had turned to full-blown panic. Where are you? The trees moved. Go back. Go back. Wayne WTF. Check UR6. The static came first, a low crackling hum, rising over the ambient noise of the forest. Wayne glanced down at the equipment, adjusting the mic. The sound didn't stop. It grew. His stomach turned. That wasn't coming from the gear, it was coming from somewhere else. Then came the sound of laughter, a dry, broken sound that took a second for Wayne to register. It was thin and warped, but there was no doubt about it. It was Wes's laugh. But there was just one problem, Wes hadn't opened his mouth. His stomach lurched. Did you? Wes shook his head violently. No. Wayne breathed heavily. His grip on the camera strap turned painful, nails pressing into his palm. They weren't alone. Something else had joined the conversation. The laughter tapered off, melting into the static and the wind, into something that hadn't been there before. And then it spoke. Did you? Wayne's voice. He staggered back a step, the ground suddenly unsteady beneath his feet. The camera slipped in his hands, the lens shaking as he swung it toward the sound. A figure stood between the trees, vaguely humanoid, the light catching it in brief flashes. Its arms were slightly too long, its fingers moving in strange, hesitant jerks. Its face, obscured by shadow, tilted curiously, observing them. Wayne could see the outline of a mouth, a suggestion of lips curling in an unnatural, half-formed grin. It took a step forward. No, that wasn't right. It hadn't taken a step, not exactly. It had skipped like the frames in a lagging video, its movement fractured into something wrong. Move. Wes whispered. Wayne couldn't. He knew better. Knew that if something wasn't right, if something felt wrong in the woods, that you didn't stare, engage, or try to understand it. And yet, he was frozen. The figure twitched again. It glitched again, closer still. And then, it spoke. Move. The voice was the same, his voice. Wes grabbed his arm, yanking him back so hard his shoulder wrenched. The moment shattered, Wayne stumbling as Wes pulled him into a full sprint. The camera swung wildly, catching nothing but streaks of black and gold as they ran. The chat was chaos. Messages blurred, thousands of people screaming through text, all of them reduced to meaningless symbols. Wayne's breath heaved. He forced himself forward, his brain catching up to his body in disjointed bursts. His shoulder ached where Wes had grabbed him. His legs burned. He had lost his bearings entirely. The only thing keeping him moving was the sound, the laughter, following them. Wayne glanced back, the camera bouncing in his grip, blurring everything into streaks of color and motion. But for a second, a single, shattering second, he saw it again, the figure standing still among the trees. And beside it, there was another. Wes. No, not Wes. Something imitating Wes. The camera jerked as Wayne ran harder, muscles protesting. They burst through the underbrush, hitting open ground. The clearing. The truck had to be close. The chat still scrolled. The stream was still live. He had to. The camera slipped from his hands. The world tilted as it tumbled, the feed capturing a final, dizzying blur. And then, it landed, upside down, screen flickering. The last thing the audience saw was Wayne and Wes, silhouettes against the distant headlights, before the screen cut to black. The chat went dead. The live stream terminated. The bodies were found 3 days later. A pair of hikers stumbled across them near a firebreak, 1.5 miles from the main road. They called it in immediately, voices unsteady as they described what they had seen: 2 men, slumped against separate trees, eyes wide open, limbs awkwardly arranged as though they had been posed. Their heads rested at unnatural angles. Detective Paul Riggins arrived at the scene just after dawn, the rising sun barely cutting through the heavy mist curling low across the ground. He had worked enough missing persons cases in the area to recognize the inevitability of grim discoveries, but this one felt different. The men hadn't just collapsed there. They had been placed. Positioned. Their expressions were not contorted in pain but frozen in a dull, absent stare. No obvious injuries. No blood. Just the wrongness of their stillness. Riggins crouched beside the nearest body, studying the way the arms were folded across the chest, fingers half-curled, like a marionette left to rest mid-motion. He didn't like the way the head sat on the shoulders, tilted too far, the skin at the throat stretched tight. A fracture, maybe. A snapped spine. The second man, positioned across from him, propped against another tree, was in the same condition. The exact same position. Riggins exhaled sharply through his nose. Jesus. A uniformed officer, young and visibly unsettled, hovered nearby. No signs of a struggle. No drag marks. He hesitated. It's like they just sat down and died. Riggins didn't respond right away. He shifted his focus to the ground, looking for any hint of what had brought them here. Boot prints led up to the trees, matching the victim's shoes, but there were no signs of pursuit. No blood. No broken branches indicating a desperate escape. The young officer cleared his throat. "You know who they are?" Riggins nodded, standing. "Yeah. I know." It had been impossible to miss. The case had already spread beyond their jurisdiction, even before the bodies turned up. Wayne Carter and Wesley Hanlon, cryptid hunters, social media personalities, paranormal thrill seekers, had gone missing after broadcasting a live stream from these very woods. Their last known moments had played out in real time to an audience of thousands. And now they were dead. Riggins had watched the footage himself. It had been difficult to follow, shaky camera work, panicked movements, the night swallowing most of the details, but the audio had been worse than the visuals. The moment when the voices started repeating, the distorted mimicry creeping into the dialogue like a parasite left an impression that Riggins hadn't been able to shake. The stream had ended in chaos, with the camera tumbling and the feed cutting out. That had been the last trace of them. Until now. A forensic tech approached, lowering her camera. "No immediate cause of death," she said, her voice tight. "No external trauma aside from the way their heads are positioned. We'll have to confirm back at the lab," but, she hesitated, glancing at the bodies before looking back at Riggins. "It doesn't look like they fought back." Riggins met her gaze. "Meaning?" "Meaning if someone, or something, did this, they didn't resist." He frowned. "That doesn't make sense." She shook her head. "No. It doesn't. The crime scene was documented, and the bodies transported, but the unease remained." As the team packed up, Riggins stood at the edge of the tree line, staring at the spot where they had been found. Something gnawed at him, an unanswered question buried in the quiet. The victims had been discovered near a firebreak. A clearing. The last place they had been seen running toward in the live stream. But there was a problem, their truck was still there. And they hadn't been anywhere near it. Holly Tran sat at her desk, fingers poised above the keyboard, staring at the live stream archive without pressing play. She had already watched it once. That had been enough. Wayne and Wes had been her friends. She had been moderating their streams for nearly 2 years, filtering through chat, banning trolls, and keeping things organized. She had never believed in the cryptid nonsense they chased, but that had never mattered. The show had been fun. A game. Until now. The official cause of death was still unknown, but the authorities weren't treating it as a homicide. No defensive wounds. No clear injuries beyond the unnatural tilt of their necks. Holly had studied every moment of the footage, analyzing the timestamps and reading the chat logs. The viewers had seen something, a figure in the trees, something shifting at the edges of the frame. At one point, someone had typed, "There are 2 Wesleys." She had paused the video and rewound it, frame by frame. It had taken her 3 attempts before she saw it. It occupied a fraction of a second. A glitch in the movement. Wayne had turned toward Wes, only Wes had already been standing next to him. The second Wes hadn't been there a moment before. Holly's stomach twisted as she replayed the moment again, her mind rejecting the impossible. The shape had been almost right, but the shoulders were slightly too high, the posture subtly wrong, the way the head moved, not like a person turning, but like a puppet being adjusted on unseen strings. It was impossible. But Wayne and Wes were dead, and their bodies had been arranged like dolls. The thought made her feel sick. The chat logs were still open. She scrolled through the final minutes, reading the frantic reactions. "Get out. Did you see that? Bro, WTF, 2 Wesleys." And then, the final comment before the feed cut, "The other one isn't leaving." Holly closed the window, pushing away from the desk. She needed air. She wasn't superstitious. She didn't believe in ghosts or demons or whatever the hell people thought they had seen in that live stream. But she believed in something being wrong. The footage hadn't been altered. There were no signs of tampering. And the worst part? Wayne had seen it, too. She could tell, now that she was looking for it, the moment his face had gone pale, his expression shifting from confusion to terror. He had realized what he was looking at. And then, he had run. The first call came just after midnight. Holly was still awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, willing herself to stop thinking about it. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked up without checking the number. At first, there was only silence. And then, she heard a low, crackling distortion. Her grip tightened. "Who is this?" In response, there was yet more static, followed by a rustling noise, like wind through trees. And then, a voice. "Who is this?" Her stomach clenched. It was her voice. A moment later, the call disconnected. She stared at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, and the call was unidentified. She lowered the phone slowly, bile rising in her throat. Just then, a notification popped up, "Cryptid pursuit is live." She gasped. That wasn't possible. The channel had been inactive since their deaths. Her fingers hovered over the screen, reluctant, but she had to see. She tapped the notification, and the stream opened. At first, the screen was entirely dark, save for a faint, shifting glow, like weak flashlight beams moving through the trees. And then, over the faint rustling of leaves, she heard a slow, shuddering, inhuman breath. The chat was already filling with messages. "What is this? Guys, this isn't right. Wayne." And then, a voice broke through the silence. "Holly." It was Wayne's voice. But something was wrong. It dragged and stretched as if the speaker was remembering the shape of the word in real time. The camera tilted slightly, adjusting, and the breath came again, slow and shuddering. And then, the screen cut to black. The chat froze, and a final message appeared, "We're not done playing."